My name is Tanya Bradshaw, and at 34 years old, my father grounded me in front of 30 relatives. He raised his glass at his own anniversary party, told the whole room he was handing the family home down to my brother, and when I said one quiet sentence, he pointed at me like I was 9. The laughter is the part I still hear. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I said one word, set down my glass, and walked upstairs. But here's what none of them knew that night, and what my father was about to learn the next morning, when he found my old room stripped empty, and our family lawyer came through the front door shaking. He believed he was passing down a legacy. He had no idea he'd spent the evening promising away a house that hadn't belonged to him for 6 years. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where the quietest person at the table turns out to be the one holding everything. If a family ever made you feel small for staying calm, you're going to understand this one all the way down. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and be sure to subscribe, so the next story finds you when you need it. The morning before everything changed, I was sitting across from 2 men who wanted my signature and didn't want to pay for it. A medical group out of Stamford wanted 9,000 square feet on Route 1, and their attorney had buried a renewal clause that would have locked my client into a 40% bump in year 3. I read it twice while he talked. I do that. I let people finish, and I let the paper say what it says. Page 11, I told him. Strike the escalator, or we walk. He smiled the way men smile when they think a woman in a good blazer is bluffing. I slid the page back across the table and waited. He struck it. That's the whole of what I do for a living, and I'm good at it. I sell and lease commercial buildings across Fairfield County, and I've done it since I was 22, starting as the assistant who got coffee and learned to read a title report before the brokers did. Numbers don't flatter you and they don't lie to you. A closing date is a closing date. A signature means a thing happened. I trust documents more than I trust most people, and I have reasons for that, which we'll get to. When the meeting ended, I gathered my keys off the table, and there's one key on that ring I never explain. Brass, worn smooth, older than the others. Most of my keys open doors I'm proud of, offices and lobbies and listings. That one I keep turned toward my palm. I've carried it for 6 years, and never once told my family what it opens. That afternoon, my mother called about the party, and I almost didn't pick up. Your father's anniversary is the 14th, my mother said, like I might have a competing event. 40 years. The whole family's coming. Then, before I could answer, the part she really called to say. Tanya, please, don't get him going this year. I said I'd be there. I always say I'll be there. In my family there are 2 kinds of children, and everyone learned which kind they were before they could spell it. Brett was the son who could do no wrong, and I was the daughter who could do nothing right. At dinners growing up, my father had a routine. He'd wait until everyone was seated, then turn to me with a question that was really a verdict. How's the little real estate hobby? Still renting your life out to strangers? He'd land it. The table would laugh because laughing was safer, and he'd finish the same way every time. Maybe one day you'll learn to apologize for that mouth. I used to think if I just did better, the questions would stop. I made President's Club 3 years running. The questions didn't stop. They got more creative. My mother's whole job, as far as I could tell, was managing the temperature in the room so my father never had to feel a single degree of discomfort, and I was usually the thing she turned down. For me, she added on the phone, just smile and let it go. I told her I would. I meant it too. I had no plan to ruin anyone's party. I drove home that night thinking I'd sit quiet, eat the cake, leave early. I didn't know yet that this year my father had built the whole evening around a lie, and that I was holding the truth in my pocket. Brett called me 2 days later, and I knew within 10 seconds it wasn't to say hello. Tanya, hey, question for my favorite real estate genius. He only calls me a genius when he needs one. The dealership he runs, a used luxury lot off the highway, had been about to turn the corner for 3 straight years. He wanted to talk numbers, he said, wanted my read on a refinance, and somewhere in the middle of it, the real ask started circling like it always does. He needed a co-signer. He needed someone with clean credit and real assets to stand behind a line for the lot. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. In the background, I could hear my father's voice, big and pleased with itself, holding court about the Bradshaw home. 3 generations, he was telling someone, built by his own father's hands, every beam. He says that at every gathering. He says it the way other men say grace. Anyway, Brett went on, you don't have to decide now. Dad's finally sorting out the whole house situation, so. He let it trail off, the way you do when you've said one word too many. House situation. I held the phone a little tighter. What house situation? I asked, light as I could. You know, Dad, Brett said, and changed the subject to his fantasy football team. I let him. But I sat there a long time after we hung up, looking at nothing, turning the phrase over. My father didn't have a house situation. He had a house he loved and bragged about and believed was his to do anything he wanted with. There was no situation to sort out, unless he thought he was about to do something with that house. And there was only one thing I could imagine him wanting to do. I have a standing appointment every spring with Arthur Hollis, who's been the family lawyer since before I had a driver's license, and who's been my lawyer, quietly, for 6 years. There are papers that need a signature once a year. Routine things. The kind of maintenance ownership asks of you. I went in expecting 20 minutes. Arthur is a careful man, gray at the temples, the sort who reads the whole document even when he wrote it. He slid the pages over. I signed where the little tabs pointed, and he capped his pen and folded his hands. Everything still fine over on Maple Lane? He asked. The question was casual. The look wasn't. Maple Lane is my parents' address. It's the house with the 3 generations and the beams my grandfather supposedly cut by hand. Fine, as far as I know, I said. Why? Arthur studied me for a second, then said it was nothing, just keeping things current, and asked how my mother was. But he held my eyes one beat too long, the way he does when he's deciding whether to tell me something or wait for me to ask the right question. I didn't ask. I'd spent 6 years not asking, not pushing, keeping a wall between what I'd done and the people I'd done it for. On my way out, I put my keys in my hand and felt the brass one settle cool against my fingers, and I closed my fist around it without meaning to. In the elevator, I made myself breathe. Whatever my father was sorting out, Arthur knew about it. And if Arthur was bringing up Maple Lane before I'd even mentioned a party, something was already in motion. I just didn't know how fast or how publicly it was about to move. I should tell you what the brass key opens, because you've earned it, and my father never did. 6 years ago, the Bradshaw home was 11 days from a foreclosure auction. The business had cratered. My father had borrowed against the house twice to fund an expansion I'd begged him not to make, a second location he opened the same month the market turned, and when it all came down, he stopped opening the mail. I found out because my mother called me at midnight, whispering so he wouldn't hear, and told me there was a notice taped to the door and she didn't know what taped to the door meant. I knew what it meant. I was 28. I had savings, a clean reputation with 3 lenders, and a habit of solving problems before anyone could refuse my help. So I solved it. Through a small company of mine, Cedar Hollow Holdings, I bought the house outright in the weeks before the auction. The bank signed off on a pre-foreclosure sale. The purchase paid the mortgage off in full, every dollar of balance and arrears and fees, and the deed was conveyed and recorded in the company's name. My parents signed the closing papers Arthur put in front of them without reading them twice, too far underwater and too relieved to ask who the investor was. Then I told them an investor had stepped in and they could stay. No rent. Indefinitely. I never said the investor was me. I didn't want him to thank me. I didn't want him to owe me. More than anything, I didn't want him to have to look at his daughter every morning and remember that she was the reason he still had a roof, because I knew that math would curdle in him and come back out as cruelty. So I let him keep his story. He told himself he'd worked something out with the bank. He told the relatives he'd weathered a rough patch. I told myself my silence was a gift. It took 6 years and 1 anniversary party to understand it had also been a leash, and I was the one holding the other end. So when Brett said house situation, I already understood the shape of the danger. My father believed the house was his. He'd believed it for 6 years, because I had worked very hard to let him. A man who believes he owns something will eventually try to give it away, sell it, borrow against it, or hand it down to the child he's decided deserves a kingdom. And the moment he tried any of that in writing, with a lawyer, the whole story I'd built to protect him would crack open in the worst possible room, at the worst possible time. The smart move, the Tanya move, was to handle it quietly. Call my father, ask to talk privately, find a gentle way to say the thing. The house is in my name. It always has been. Let's figure this out. Just us. No audience. No shame. I drafted that conversation in my head a dozen times over the next week. I never made the call. Part of it was cowardice. And I'll own that. Part of it was something harder to admit. A small, ugly hope that I no longer wanted to feel, that maybe if I kept carrying him long enough, he'd finally see me. Then my phone buzzed with a text from Arthur Hollis, 2 lines, and the careful man dropped the careful tone. Tanya, I think we should talk before the party. It may be sooner than you'd like. I read it twice. Sooner than I'd like meant my father had already set something in motion with Arthur, something tied to the 14th. I texted back that I'd call him after the weekend. I should have called him that minute. But I drove out to Maple Lane on the day of the party still telling myself I could keep this quiet, and walked straight into the loudest night of my life. Maple Lane in October looks like a postcard somebody paid for. The maples were going copper, the lawn was cut in stripes, and there were rented white chairs fanned out across the back patio for 40 years of marriage. I parked at the curb and sat a second, gathering myself, watching my family's house glow from the inside like it had never seen a foreclosure notice in its life. Beside the front door is a slab of bluestone my father had set into the brick, engraved in serious capital letters, Bradshaw, EST, 1981. He'd had it recut last year, sharper and deeper, because the first one had weathered and he couldn't stand a faded name. I ran my thumb over the lettering on my way past, the way you'd touch a thing you used to believe in. Funny, what a name on a house tells you. It tells you who's proud. It tells you nothing at all about whose name is on the deed. Inside, the grandfather clock in the front hall was ticking its heavy tick, the one my father swears his own father carried up from Pennsylvania, and the house smelled like my mother's cider and somebody's expensive perfume. Sloane, my brother's wife, was in the foyer holding her phone up at arm's length, narrating to it in a bright voice. And this, she was saying to her followers, sweeping the camera up the staircase, is going to be our forever home. She caught me watching and smiled with all her teeth. Tanya, you came. Like I was a weather event. I said hello, took the cider my mother pressed into my hands, and let the warmth of the room close over me. 40 years, 30 relatives, a name carved in stone by the door. And every single symbol of my father's legacy, I realized, was something he'd either borrowed, inherited, or never actually owned. The family ate early, before the wider crowd arrived. 12 of us crowded around the dining table my father runs like a small republic. He waited until the green beans were going around, then aimed. Tanya, you still selling other people's buildings? Or did you finally make something of your own? A couple of cousins laughed on cue. My mother's hand tightened on her napkin. The old me would have smiled and let it roll off, the way I'd promised her on the phone. But I'd spent the week reading my father's silence like a contract, and I was tired in a place that smiling couldn't reach. I sell buildings, Dad, I said, easy and level. Brett borrows against them. We're not the same job. The table went quiet for a half-second too long. Brett's fork stopped. My father's face did a thing I'd seen 1,000 times, the slow red climb up from the collar, but he didn't fire back. He just looked at me, surprised, like a dog that's been swatted by something it assumed was furniture. Then he laughed, short and hard, and turned to his brother to talk about the Giants, dismissing me by changing the channel. Across the table my mother mouthed 3 words at me. Please, not tonight. I gave her a small nod, because I love her in the complicated way you love the person who taught you to make yourself smaller. But under the table my hands were steady, and I noticed that. For the first time at that table, the heat in my face wasn't shame, it was something cooler and clearer, the feeling you get when you finally understand the terms of a deal you've been losing for years. I ate my green beans, I let him have the giants, and I waited to see what my father thought he was about to do with the house in front of everyone. Brett cornered me in the kitchen between dinner and the guests, scraping plates he had no intention of washing. Hey, about that cosign thing. He kept his voice low and his eyes on the sink. The lot needed $140,000 to refinance the floor plan, he said. The inventory loan and the credit union wanted a guarantor with assets. It's a formality, he said. You wouldn't pay a dime. It just sits there with your name on it. I've heard that sentence in a dozen deals, and it has never once been true. A signature that just sits there is a signature that owns you the day everything goes wrong. No, I said, not unkind, just done. I'm not going to do that, Brett. He set the plate down too hard. You know, Dad said you'd be like this. He turned, and there was something rehearsed in it, like he'd been handed his lines. He said you'll come around once you learn to apologize. To me. For that crack at dinner. For, I don't know. For the way you are. Learn to apologize. There it was again. The family's favorite verb. The thing I was perpetually failing to do. Apologize for what, exactly? I asked. Brett couldn't answer it. He never could, because the apology was never about a specific sin. It was about posture. They wanted me bent. He muttered something about me always thinking I was smarter than everyone, and pushed back out toward the noise. I stood at the sink for a minute with the water running over my hands. Through the window I could see the first headlights turning onto Maple Lane, the relatives arriving, a whole audience filing in. And somewhere out front my father was probably touching that bluestone again, telling someone about the beams, getting ready to give a speech I was starting to dread. I found him on the front step with 3 of my uncles, all holding beers, and he had his hand flat on the bluestone like a man swearing on a Bible. Recut it myself last spring, he was saying, cost me $400 and worth every penny. A name should be permanent. He saw me in the doorway and his chin came up. Tanya, come tell your uncles about the market. She knows numbers. This one. I'll give her that. It was as close to a compliment as he gets, and it had a hook in it. This one. Like I was a clever pet. Then he patted the stone again and said the thing he'd clearly been saying all week. This house is going to Brett. Time to put the name where it belongs, on a man who'll keep the family together. My uncles nodded. One of them clapped Brett on the shoulder, and I stood there in the doorway holding the truth in my mouth like a stone of my own, knowing that the name carved in that blue stone and the name on the deed in Arthur Hollis's office were not the same name, and hadn't been for 6 years. He'd recut the stone. He'd never once checked the paper underneath it. I want to stop here for just a second because, if you've ever stood in a doorway holding a thing, you could say that would change a whole room, and chosen not to say it yet. You know that exact silence. I've lived in it for years. If you know it too, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is the reason I finally stopped being quiet. I smiled at my uncles. I said the market was complicated, and I went to find a glass of wine I wasn't going to drink, because I'd decided I wanted to be completely clear-headed for whatever my father did next. I went up to my old bedroom to get 5 minutes of quiet. It still had my high school desk and a quilt my mother made the year I left for college, and standing in it I felt the full strange weight of the night. This was my house. Not the room I grew up resenting, the actual structure, the brick and the beams and the bluestone, all of it sitting on a deed with my company's name on it. And the man downstairs was at this moment promising it to my brother in front of 30 people. I took out my phone and started a text to Arthur. He's going to announce it tonight. The house. I think I should just tell him before he does, privately. My thumb hovered. I thought about my mother's face, the way it would crumple. I thought about my father's pride, which was the most fragile and most dangerous thing in that house. And then I thought about Brett's $140,000 and the word formality and a co-signature that just sits there, and I felt the floor of the whole evening shift under me. I deleted the text. I reached into my pocket and took out the brass key and held it in the lamplight. This small worn thing I'd carried for 6 years and never explained. It opens the front door of this house. It's the owner's key. I'd had it cut the week I took the deed and never used it, because using it would have meant admitting what it was. I closed my hand around it. For 6 years, that key had felt like a secret I was keeping to protect my father. Standing in my childhood room, listening to him give my house away through the floorboards, it finally felt like what it actually was. Mine. The whole thing. Mine. I need to back up half a day, because the thing that truly decided me happened that morning, before any guest arrived. Before the speech, before the grounding. I'd come out early to help my mother set up, and I came down to the kitchen at 6:30 for coffee, while the house was still dark and asleep. Or I thought it was asleep. The coffee maker was already gurgling. There were voices coming from the dining room, low, the careful kind of low people use when they think no one's awake to hear. My father, my mother, Brett. I stopped in the hallway with an empty mug in my hand, close enough to the doorway that I could hear every word through the gap, far enough that the dark hid me. I want to be precise about what this was, because it matters. I didn't record it. I didn't creep closer or hold my breath against a wall. I just stood in my own family's hallway at dawn, holding a coffee mug, and listened to the three of them lay out a plan I was never supposed to know. And what I heard in the next 90 seconds did more than make me angry. It rearranged something. It took the soft, hopeful, 6 years patient part of me, the part that still believed if I gave enough, I'd eventually be loved correctly, and it set that part down gently and walked it out of the house. By the time the coffee maker beeped, I was a different person than the one who'd come down the stairs. Let me tell you exactly what they said, standing in that dining room, certain they were alone. Once it's in Brett's name, my father was saying, he takes a home equity line against it. The house is worth what now? $650? He pulls 150, easy, drops it straight into the lot. Brett's voice, eager. And the rest for the wedding. Sloane's mother's already booked the venue. My mother, quieter, a little worried. And Tanya? A pause, the clink of a spoon. Then my father, and I'll remember the exact shape of it as long as I live, said it slow and satisfied, like he'd thought it through and liked the plan. She'll apologize to her brother first, then she'll learn her place. After that, she'll co-sign whatever we put in front of her. She always does. She acts hard, but she folds. She just needs to be reminded she's not the favorite and never was. Nobody argued. My mother didn't argue. That was the part that closed the door. She just said, "Don't make a scene at the party, Gordon." And my father said, "I'll make exactly the scene I want to make in my own house." His house. They were going to give away my house, pull $150,000 out of it for a failing car lot, and a venue Sloane's mother liked, and then walk me out in front of the whole family until I was soft enough to guarantee the loan that would put my own property at risk. The arithmetic of it was almost beautiful. Every piece depended on me being exactly who they'd trained me to be: quiet, useful, ashamed, and grateful for scraps. I set my empty mug on the hall table without a sound. I didn't feel like crying, and I didn't feel like screaming. I felt the way I feel when I finally find the buried clause in a contract, the one that changes everything, the one the other side hoped I'd never read. I'd found it. Now I just had to decide what to do with it. I went back upstairs and sat on the edge of my old bed and made one decision that unmade 20 years of habit. I was not going to save them this time. Not from the foreclosure they'd already forgotten. Not from the loan that would bury Brett. Not from the scene my father was so excited to make. For 6 years I'd stood between this family and every consequence it earned, and all it had bought me was a plan to use my silence as a crowbar. So I stopped holding the door. I texted Arthur Hollis, and I kept it short, because Arthur and I understand each other in short sentences. If he tries to convey the house, or announces it tonight, I want the truth on the table tomorrow morning, in writing. And I want the termination notice drafted and ready, just in case. 3 dots. Then his reply. You're certain? This can't be unsaid. I looked at the quilt and the high school desk and the brass key in my palm. I'm certain, I wrote. Then I did the second thing. The thing that mattered more than the text. I packed. Quietly, methodically, the way I do everything. I folded the clothes I kept here for visits and zipped them into my bag. I took my few books off the shelf. I stripped the bed and folded the quilt my mother made into a neat square at the foot of the mattress, because I wanted the room to be unmistakable in the morning, not messy, not angry, just empty. I wasn't going to ruin anyone's anniversary. I decided that too. I was just going to stop pretending the house I'd be standing in all night was theirs to give away. Then I washed my face, put on my good blazer, and went down to be a guest at my father's party. By 7, the house was full. 30-some relatives, the rented chairs filled, kids chasing each other through the legs of adults, my father in a navy blazer accepting congratulations like a man receiving tribute. I got the full tour of being a 34-year-old single woman at a family party. An aunt asked, twice, whether I was seeing anyone special. A cousin's husband explained the stock market to me. Sloane found me by the dessert table and showed me her phone, a glowing little video of the staircase. Our forever home, she said again, watching my face for envy. Brett and I are thinking spring for the renovation. I told her the staircase was beautiful, which was true, because I'd had the treads refinished myself 3 years ago and never mentioned it. The grandfather clock chimed the half-hour, that deep brass note that fills the whole front hall, and my father raised his voice over it. Listen to that, he told a knot of cousins. My father carried that clock up from Lancaster in 1962. Wedding gift. Can't put a price on history. I happen to know he'd bought that clock at an estate sale in Danbury 11 years ago for $600, because I'd been with my mother when she found it and talked him down from 8. But the relatives murmured, impressed, and the clock kept its grave time, and I understood the whole house a little better than I had an hour before. The name on the door, the clock in the hall, the legacy in the speech he was about to give. Borrowed, bought, or made up. Every monument my father had built to himself rested on a story, and the only thing in that house that rested on paper was a deed with my name on it, folded in a lawyer's office across the county. Arthur Hollis came at 8, in a gray suit, carrying nothing but a small leather folio, and the sight of him steadied me the way a tax document steadies me. He found me near the back doors and tipped his head toward the porch. We stepped out into the cold. I came because you should have a friendly face here tonight, he said, and because I want you certain before anything happens that can't be walked back. He told me plainly where things stood. The deed was clean and recorded. Cedar Hollow Holdings, my company, sole owner, 6 years on record. My parents were, in the eyes of the law, occupants at the sufferance of the owner, which was a very polite phrase for tenants who could be asked to leave with proper notice. He'd drafted that notice. It sat in his folio, unsigned. He'd also brought a certified copy of the deed. But Tanya, he said, and lowered his voice, if your father stands up in front of these people tonight and announces he's giving this house to your brother, he is making a representation that is false. In front of 30 witnesses, if they act on it, if Brett borrows against a house he doesn't own, that's not just embarrassing. That's exposure. For all of them. I asked what he wanted me to do. He thought about it, looking out at the cold yard and the rented chairs. Nothing, he said finally. Tonight. Nothing. Not here, not in front of 30 relatives and a phone camera. If you correct him at his own party, you hand him the fight he wants in the one room where he always wins, and you become the daughter who ruined the anniversary. So let him talk. Let him finish. He looked at me. A man digging a hole works faster when no one tries to take the shovel. Then his face went serious. But hear me on this. A speech is just talk, and talk we can let go. The day he tries to make it real, to sign something, to actually move that house, The silence is over and we move the same hour. Quietly, in writing, on our terms, not his. I said all right. He went back inside to get a drink he wasn't going to finish either. My father gave his speech at 9, with a champagne flute and the grandfather clock behind him like a witness he'd hired. He talked about 40 years of marriage and he was good at it, I'll give him that. Warm and funny, getting the aunts misty. He thanked my mother for putting up with a stubborn man, and everyone laughed and she pressed a knuckle to the corner of her eye. Then his voice changed, dropped into the gravel he uses for important things, and he set his free hand on the back of a chair like a man steadying himself for history. Some of you know this house has been in our family a long time, he said. 3 generations. My father built it. And a house like this, it isn't just property. It's the family. It's who we are. He let that sit. So tonight, on this anniversary, Carol and I want to make something known. When the time comes, this house, the Bradshaw home, is going to my son, to Brett. Because Brett is the one who'll keep this family together, who understands what a legacy means. Applause broke out, warm and easy. My uncles raised glasses. Sloane had her phone up over her head, filming the whole thing, and Brett stood there flushing with a pleasure so naked it was almost hard to watch. My mother smiled and looked at her shoes, and I stood at the edge of the room with my untouched wine and did exactly what Arthur told me to do. Nothing. I didn't correct him. I didn't roll my eyes. I let my father stand in a house he didn't own and promise it, on the record, in front of every relative who mattered, with a camera running. I want you to understand, that applause was the sound of him picking up the shovel. I just stood quietly at the edge of the hole and let him dig. It was Brett who turned a speech into a scene, the way he turns everything into a scene eventually. He'd had a few, and the applause had gone to his head, and on his way to refill his glass he stopped near me and decided to perform. And here she is, he announced, loud enough to pull eyes our way. My big sister. Sells houses to strangers for a living but can't hold on to a man or a clue. A few people laughed, the uncomfortable kind, because Brett's the favorite and you laugh at the favorite's jokes. He grinned, encouraged. Maybe someday Dad'll leave you the garage. More laughter. He was waiting for me to flush, to go quiet, to take it like I always took it. I set my wine down on the side table. I do sell houses, Brett, I said, and I kept my voice pleasant and clear, no edge to grab. That's probably why I can tell the difference between owning one and borrowing against one. The laughter cut off. Brett blinked. What's that supposed to mean? It means $140,000 of inventory loan doesn't refinance itself, I said. And it means you should be careful what you let people promise you in front of a crowd. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even cruel. It was just true. And true landed in that room like a dropped plate. Sloane's smile froze. An aunt looked at Brett, then at me, then back. And across the room my father went the deep red I'd known my whole life, the climb up from the collar because his golden son had been answered calmly by the daughter who was supposed to be furniture, and there was an audience. He put his glass down hard enough to ring, and he came across the room toward me. He stopped 3 feet from me, close enough that the nearest relatives went quiet to watch, and he did the thing that gives this story its name. He pointed at me, not gestured. Pointed, one finger, the way you point at a child who's tracked mud across the floor, and his voice came out loud enough to reach the back of the room. You don't get to talk to your brother that way. Not in my house. I said nothing. You think you're better than this family? You think those little jokes are clever? Still nothing. And then, because an audience makes him bigger and he couldn't stop himself, he reached all the way back to the language of my childhood and said it. You're grounded until you apologize to your brother. For a second the room didn't know what to do with it. A grown woman, 34 years old, in a good blazer, being grounded by her father at his anniversary party. Then somebody laughed, a single bark, and it gave everyone permission, and the laughter spread across the room like spilled wine, warm and loose and at my expense. My face went hot. I felt every degree of it. 30 relatives, the clock ticking, Sloane's phone catching the whole thing. My brother smirking, my mother staring hard at the floor and saying nothing, saying nothing, saying nothing. My father stood there flushed and triumphant, waiting for me to crumble or cry or fight, which were the only three things he knew me to do. I did none of them. I looked at him, and I felt the brass key in my pocket, and I said the only word the moment deserved. All right. Just that. He thought all right meant I'd surrendered. He smiled like he'd won. He had no idea that all right was the sound of me setting down a weight I'd carried for 6 years, turning around and walking up the stairs to a room I'd already emptied. I want to pause here, because I know some of you are listening to this in a car, or a kitchen, or in bed with the lights off, and some of you have stood exactly where I stood, in a room full of people who laughed, while someone shrank you down to a child. I didn't argue and I didn't cry, and I want you to remember what I did instead. Because the morning was coming, and the morning belonged to me. If you've ever said the calmest word of your life when everyone expected you to break, comment that word below, and subscribe, because the deed is about to speak. Now. Upstairs, the party still going under my feet, I finished what I'd started that morning. The room was already mostly empty, the bed already stripped, the quilt already folded in its neat square. I zipped my bag. I looked around at the desk and the bare shelves, and the rectangle of unfaded paint where a poster used to hang, and I felt, against all odds, light. Then I took the brass key out of my pocket, the owner's key I'd carried 6 years and never used, and I did something with it I'd never done. I set it down. Not mine. The spare house key from the hook in the kitchen, the one my parents kept for me, the guest key. I set that one on the nightstand where they'd find it. The brass one, the real one, I kept. I put it back in my pocket and felt it settle warm against my hip. Then I texted Arthur Hollis one line. He announced it, in front of everyone, on camera. Send it in the morning, in person. 3 dots. Then. I'll be there at 9. I carried my bag down the back stairs and out to my car, and I drove home, and I slept better than I had in years. My father called Arthur Hollis at 8 the next morning. I know the time because Arthur told me after, and because my father was the kind of man who'd start a victory before breakfast. He was riding high. The party had gone exactly the way he wanted. His daughter had been put in her place in front of everyone. The family had applauded his legacy, and now it was time to make the legacy official. So he called his lawyer from the kitchen, with my mother pouring coffee a few feet away, and he didn't ask. He ordered. Arthur, draw up the papers. I want the house in Brett's name. Today, if you can manage it. Arthur, on the other end, went very quiet. He's described that silence to me since the half-second where he held the truth in his hand and decided how to hold it. Because Arthur knew. Arthur had known for 6 years. He'd recorded the deed himself. And here was Gordon Bradshaw, ordering him to transfer a property that belonged to Gordon's daughter in writing, today. My father took the silence for hesitation and bulldozed on. It's not complicated, Arthur. It's my house. I just want my son's name on it. And Arthur Hollis, who had spent 30 years being the careful man who never raised his voice, said 6 words and hung up. Gordon, don't sign anything. I'm coming. He didn't explain. He didn't soften it. He grabbed the leather folio off his desk, the one with the certified deed and the unsigned notice, got in his car, and drove out to Maple Lane faster than a man his age should drive. Meanwhile, in that kitchen, my father set down the phone, a little puzzled by the click, and turned to find me sitting at his table. I'd come back at 8:30. I wanted to be there. He looked genuinely pleased to see me, which tells you everything about how the night had landed for him. To my father, I'd come back the way I always came back, chastened, ready to apologize, ready to be useful again. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter and looked at me sitting there in my coat, my hands wrapped around a mug I'd helped myself to, and he gave me a slow, satisfied smile, the smile of a man who believes the world has just confirmed his opinion of himself. Well, he said, Look who came back. I didn't answer. My mother stood very still by the sink. Finally learned your place? He said. There it was. The second sentence that built this story. The bookend to the first. You're grounded until you apologize to your brother. And now, the morning after, finally learned your place. He said it the way he says everything that's cruel. Lightly. Almost fondly. Like it was just a bit of family teasing and I was the one with the problem if it stung. I set my mug down on the table, slow and quiet, and I looked at him. I had a whole answer to that question. I'd find out my place soon enough, and so would he, and it was a place he'd never once thought to check. But I didn't say it yet. Arthur had told me to let my father finish digging, and my father wasn't quite finished. So I held the answer, and I let the silence stretch, and my father, never able to stand a silence he didn't fill, frowned and pushed off the counter and decided to go make sure his point had landed. He decided to go check my room. I heard him go up the stairs, heavy and certain, still riding last night. I heard the door of my old room open. Then I heard the certainty go out of his footsteps. He came back down slower than he went up. He stood in the kitchen doorway holding the guest key I'd left on the nightstand, turning it over in his fingers, and for the first time that morning the smile was gone. Where are your things? He said. It wasn't quite a question. Tanya, why is your room empty? My mother had stopped moving entirely. I moved them, I said. When? Last night. He stared at me, and I watched him try to fit the empty room into the story he'd told himself, the story where I came crawling back to apologize, and the pieces wouldn't go. You don't get to just leave, he said, and his voice climbed. This is a family. You don't pack up and sneak out of a family in the middle of the night like a tenant skipping rent. The word hung there. Tenant. He'd reached for an insult and grabbed, without knowing it, the exact legal word for what he was. My mother made a small sound, and before my father could decide what to do with the empty room and the guest key and the daughter sitting calmly at his table refusing to perform her part, the doorbell rang. Then it rang again, fast, twice more, the bell of a man who can't wait for it to be answered. My father went to the door because he's a man who always answers his own door, and he opened it, and Arthur Hollis stood on the step gray-faced with a folio in his hand. A few of the relatives had stayed the night, the ones who'd had too much champagne, my father's brother and his wife, 2 cousins, and they were drifting into the kitchen for coffee just as Arthur came through the door, so the room filled up fast, which is the only mercy the universe granted me that morning. An audience. Arthur didn't take his coat off. He didn't shake my father's hand. He stood in the front hall under the grandfather clock with his folio clutched against his chest, and his voice when it came out was shaking. This careful man. This man I'd never heard raise his voice in 30 years. Sir, he said. What have you done? My father's face went from confusion to anger in about a second, because nobody talks to Gordon Bradshaw that way in his own house. What are you talking about? I called you 20 minutes ago. I told you to put the house in Brett's name, that's all. What's gotten into you? What's gotten into me, Arthur said, is that last night you promised this house to your son in front of 30 people, and this morning you ordered me to sign it over for real. I held my tongue at your party, Gordon. I am not going to stand here and help you give away something that isn't yours to give. Arthur looked at him, and then he looked past him, at me, sitting at the table, and there was a question in it. May I? I gave him the smallest nod. The relatives were quiet now, sensing weather. Brett had appeared at the top of the stairs in yesterday's shirt, Sloane behind him with her phone, but not filming now, just holding it, watching. My mother had her back to the counter and both hands flat on it like she needed it to stand, and Arthur Hollis opened the folio and took out a single certified document, heavy paper, county seal, the kind of paper that doesn't care how loud you are, or how proud, and he laid it down on the dining room table. On the exact table where my father had carved me up at 100 family dinners. He smoothed it flat with one hand. Gordon, he said, gently now, the anger gone, only the truth left. You can't give Brett this house. It isn't yours. It hasn't been yours for 6 years. For a moment, nobody breathed. My father looked down at the document on the table, then up at Arthur, then around at the relatives, with the expression of a man who's been told the floor isn't real. What is this? He said. What is this? Arthur put one finger on the page. This is the deed to this property, recorded 6 years ago. The owner of record is Cedar Hollow Holdings, LLC. He paused. The sole member of that company, he said, is your daughter, Tanya. The kitchen made a sound, a collective intake, an uncle's low "oh." Sloane's hand came up to her mouth. Brett came down 2 stairs and stopped, and my father stood there and did the thing I'd known he would do, because villains in real life don't crumble quietly and they don't apologize. They reach for the nearest weapon, and his was always volume. That's a lie, he said, and then louder. That's a forgery. That's... What did you do, Tanya? What did you cook up with him? He was shouting now, the red all the way up past his collar, jabbing his finger at the paper like he could puncture it. 6 years? 6 years you've been... What? You own my house? You expect me to believe you bought my house? And here is the part I'd been waiting for, the part Arthur told me to let him reach on his own. I didn't shout. I didn't even stand up. I kept my hands around my coffee and my voice low and level, the voice I use when a deal is already won and everyone just needs to catch up to the paper. You didn't lose the house 6 years ago, Dad, I said. It was 11 days from auction. Mom called me at midnight. You'd stopped opening the mail. The kitchen was dead silent now. I bought the house before it ever went to auction. I paid the bank every dollar it was owed, and the deed was put in the company's name. And then I told you an investor had worked something out because I thought, if I just kept that one thing from you, you'd never have to know how close you came. I looked at him. I bought your house so you'd never have to feel what you just felt. You're welcome. My father did not say thank you. I didn't expect him to. What he did was move through the whole catalog of a cornered man in about 90 seconds, and I watched it the way you watch weather you've predicted. First he kept denying, sputtering about forgeries and tricks, until Arthur quietly pointed out that the county records were public and he was welcome to look them up on his phone. Then he switched to attack, wheeling on me. You did this to humiliate me. You waited. You waited for my anniversary, in front of everyone. You planned this. Which was rich, coming from the man who'd planned a public grounding to soften me up for a co-signature. But I let it go by. Then, when attack didn't land, he reached for the oldest tool in the box, the one that had worked on me my whole life. Self-pity. After everything I did for you, he said, and his voice cracked, real or performed, I genuinely couldn't tell anymore. I gave you a home. I gave you a name. And this is what you do to your father. And there, by the counter, my mother finally spoke. She'd been silent through all of it. The speech, the grounding, the mourning, silent the way she's been silent my whole life. But now she looked at me, and her eyes were wet, and she said, very quietly, Tanya, I knew. I always knew. For 1 second the whole room tilted towards something like grace. Then she turned and put her hand on my father's arm and said, Gordon, sit down before you make yourself sick. And just like that she chose him, the way she'd chosen him for 40 years, and the second passed. It was the closest thing to an apology I got from either of them, and it wasn't one. My father sat down heavily in his chair, and I stood up finally, and I answered the question he'd asked me an hour before. You asked if I'd finally learned my place, I said. I have. It's right here. On the deed. Here's the part people always expect to be the sweetest, and it wasn't, and I'm glad it wasn't. They expect me to throw them out, to stand in the doorway of the house I owned and tell my father to get off my property, to feel the lever finally in my own hand and pull it. I thought about it. I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about it for one warm, ugly second. But I didn't drive out there that morning to take a house. I drove out there to stop being the family's emergency fund and silent partner and favorite thing to humiliate. And you don't accomplish that by becoming cruel. You accomplish it with terms. So I had Arthur lay it out, plainly, the way I'd lay out a deal. You can stay, I said. I'm not putting my parents on the street. But it stops being a story you tell and starts being a real arrangement. Option 1. You rent this house from me on a written lease, at a fair number, well under market, in writing, like adults. Option 2. If you want it to truly be yours, you buy it from me at appraised value, and Brett can co-sign that loan if he's so eager to put his name on this house. Brett, at the bottom of the stairs, found something fascinating about his shoes. And there's one condition either way, I said, and I let it land. The lease runs month to month. No one at this table gets grounded, mocked, or made small again. Not me, not anyone. The next time it happens, I give notice the legal way, the lease ends on schedule, and the offer to buy goes with it. Arthur took the unsigned notice out of the folio and set it on the table, next to the deed, so they understood it was real and ready. I'm not taking your home, I told my father, who wouldn't look at me. I'm just taking my name off the list of people you get to humiliate for free. Then I picked up my coffee, finished it, and reached into my pocket for my keys. I walked out the front door alone. Nobody followed me, which was its own kind of answer, and which I found I didn't mind. Behind me, the kitchen had gone into the low, frantic murmur of a family rearranging its entire understanding of itself. My uncle asking questions, Sloane already on her phone deleting things, my father not saying a word. On my way out, I passed the bluestone by the door. Bradshaw, EST 1981, recut last spring for $400 because a name should be permanent. I stopped and looked at it for a second in the cold morning light. I could have taken it. It was mine, technically, the stone and the brick it was set into, and every beam behind it. I didn't. I left the name right where it was, because the name was never the thing that mattered. Anyone can carve a name in stone. The question is always, only, whose name is on the paper. And everyone in that house knew the answer now. I took out my keys and found the brass one, the owner's key, worn smooth from 6 years in my pocket, and I held it in my palm one last second in the doorway of the house I'd quietly saved and never once been thanked for. Then I put it away, and I walked to my car, and I did not look back at the window where I knew my mother was standing. The night before, my father had told a room full of people I was grounded until I apologized. I'd said one word. All right. Standing in that doorway the next morning, in the cold, with my own house at my back, it finally was. They took the lease. Of course they took the lease. It was the kindest deal they'd ever been offered, and the first one that was honest. My parents signed a month-to-month lease with Cedar Hollow Holdings, at a fair monthly number, well under what the house would fetch, and for the first time in 6 years the arrangement matched the truth. The home equity plan died the moment it met reality, because you can't borrow against a house you don't own, and Brett's lot, with no rescue coming and no cosigner to bleed dry, closed for good before spring. The golden child, it turns out, only shines as long as someone's holding the light. When I stopped, he dimmed fast. Sloane deleted every video of the forever home. I checked, a little pettily, and they were all gone. The relatives sorted themselves the way relatives do, some quietly proud of me, a few certain I'd done something unforgivable to a sweet old man, most just relieved it hadn't happened at their party. And my mother started calling me, not to manage me, not to ask me to keep the peace, just to talk, carefully, like someone learning a language late. I still have the brass key. I keep it on my ring with all the others now, not turned toward my palm anymore, not hidden. It doesn't feel like a secret. It feels like what it always was, and what I never let it be, which is simply a door I'm allowed to open, on a house I chose to save, for reasons that were always mine and never required anyone's permission or thanks. I go back to Maple Lane now and then, but I go as a guest, which is a funny thing to be in a house you own. I knock. I sit at the table where I used to be served as the evening's entertainment, and these days nobody reaches for a joke at my expense, because they all know the lease has a clause now, even though it doesn't. Not really. The only clause is that I'll leave and not come back if it starts again. And they believe me, because for the first time in their lives they've seen me mean a thing all the way through. My father and I don't talk much, but the last time I left, he walked me to the door, past the blue stone with his name on it, and he stopped, and he struggled with it, his jaw working, and he finally got out 2 words. He's probably never said to me in my life. Thank you. Short. Clumsy. Looking at the floor. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't enough, and I took it anyway. Because some men can only carry one heavy word at a time, and that was his. Silence can be a gift you give the people you love, but the moment they start mistaking it for permission to make you small, the kindest thing you can do for everyone at the table is finally stop holding the weight, stop protecting them from the truth, and let the paper say what's true out loud. That's my story. One name carved in stone, another name on the deed, and a single quiet word that finally meant exactly what it said. If a family ever taught you that staying calm meant staying silent, take this as your sign to know precisely what you hold and to stop apologizing for holding it. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.